Hey everyone, in this video we're going to be looking at three concepts related to development and usability of GraphQL, of the GraphQL system. The first is validation, the second is execution, and the last one is introspection. So let's get started with validation. As the name implies, the validation aspect of GraphQL ensures that you can only make correct queries and mutations. In fact, when you get started, you might find that the validation system that's in place is very aggressive. For example, that if you have a field that's a type of a number and you signify in the code that it's a string, you'll end up getting an error. Or if you try to query a field that doesn't exist on a type, you'll get a red squiggly line as an error in the GraphQL playground. It's a double-edged sword, because it makes development much slower, while at the same time it means that once your queries are written and the server is set up, it's going to be much more guaranteed to work as expected every time. So this highly strict validation also makes it easier to expand on in the future by you or others on your team, because the inputs and outputs and the kinds of fields in each query are preset and won't be modified without the explicit intention to do so. So relative to how it would be without the validation system, it is more work up front, but in exchange, it's more stable to work with in the future. Probably the most common validation error that you'll be seeing is querying for a field that doesn't exist. For example, defining something as a string in one place, and then it's a number elsewhere, or it just doesn't even exist elsewhere. And then the last one that comes to mind is when you query a field that's actually a sub, or that's actually an object that has sub fields that you need to query from it. So for example, if you have a query called person, or sorry, if you have a field in a query called person, and you try to query for person, it might give an error saying that you have to specify which subfield you want to query, such as name or height, and so on. The next section we have to talk about is related to execution. And this is what happens after you write and validate your queries and mutations. As part of this execution, we have a few new topics to go into related to something called resolvers. So we'll spend some time on that now. There's a function that's needed to populate results for every field, and this is what's called a resolver. If you think about it, something has to do the reaching back into the database table and finding the correct value that you're asking for and returning it up in a response. So the most basic resolver would be one that takes a param like an ID and then goes back into the database and then returns the record that corresponds to the ID that was passed in. There are 4 params that a resolver itself, that function, takes. And so the first is an object, the second is args, the third is context, and the fourth is info. The object and info aren't usually used in my experience, or at least if it's passed in, it isn't manipulated explicitly. But args and context are important because args is the object that holds your filtering arguments. This would be the ID or whatever field you're filtering by. And context holds data about your session, which is important for things like authorization, authentication, and so on. And so, you need that to be able to connect to the database in the first place, right? So these 4 inputs make sure that you have a correctly formed request and can handle the responses needed. And so from there, all that's left to do is look at the results. As with other transfer protocols like REST, the response from GraphQL queries and mutations is usually in the shape of a JSON object. And you can work with that in the client as you would any other JavaScript object. So it's very convenient to, once your data has been pulled to the front end, you can manipulate it very easily from there. So for the last topic in this video, we're going to be talking about introspection. And as Socrates said, the unexamined life is not worth living. And I'm saying the same is true for GraphQL operations. I'm just kidding. It's not necessarily true. And if you're using the GraphQL playground to test your operations, then this particular tidbit isn't going to be too terribly helpful, because the playground has pretty robust documentation, or it generates pretty robust documentation as a result of the types that you've written. But anyways, there's a handful of special fields that you can query anywhere because they're internal to GraphQL itself, as opposed to a field that you have to explicitly define. So they're noted by leading double underscores in the name, and they are underscore underscore schema, underscore underscore type, type kind, field, input value, enum value, and directive. And by the way, those ones that I said that were two words, you put them together as one word. So input value is one word. So you can pass any of these into a query, and you can specify subfields and get definitions for the types that you've created. And I'm not spending too much time on these on this section because the video is already getting kind of long. And like I said before, the GraphQL Playground generates extremely robust documentation that gives you the ability to find any definitions for your inputs, outputs, data types, all of the above, through a very usable interface in your browser without having to write any extra queries or any writing your own documentation, for example. So that's all for this video. I hope you found it helpful and thought-provoking, and I'll see you all in the next one.